So I'm going to start out and talk a little bit about development of corn. And I will say that compared to soybeans, I think corn is a little more complicated. And my intention was to try to do kind of a beginning season to end of season, but it's a lot of stuff. So I thought I would just focus primarily on kind of end of season growth and development, starting with tassel and kind of working through the reproductive stages. And maybe give you some pointers if you're trying to troubleshoot if there's some ear development issues, maybe what might have happened during the season to give the results that you have. Because we got a lot of folks looking at ears. We've had some unusual weather this year as far as the heat in the summer, and we had, again, one of those cool springs. The thing about corn, soybeans, obviously, when they start blooming, they're photoperiod sensitive, and that tends to drive reproductive development. For corn, pretty much everything is temperature driven. And you can see from the chart on the right, it's kind of an average hybrid, an average number of heat units, or DD50s. It's heat unit accumulation basically drives everything from leaf emergence to tassel emergence, the reproductive stages. And then after maturity, even dry down is a heat unit accumulated process. So everything is a temperature deal. So corn development is based on DD50s. And so between 50 degrees and 86 degrees, corn will develop at a predictable way. Below 50 degrees, nothing happens. Above 86 degrees, we actually don't count those temperatures towards heat unit accumulation. And it's not that corn doesn't do anything at, between 86 and maybe low 90s. It's just that rate of development is not predictable anymore. And so the cutoff is 86 degrees. Once we get above 95 degrees, it's just kind of a heat stress, and it can have some potential impacts on the crop. So, I'm going to talk about tassel and some of the reproductive stages, but sometimes, what we see now, as far as the ear, it may not be, you might have had great weather at tassel, you may have had, enough rain to kind of get through some of these seed fill stages, but sometimes things that happened actually quite early in the season affect what we see now. So, for example, at about B7 corn, that corn plant is determining the rows around that cob. So very early on, it's giving that preliminary set there at the growing point. So around B12 to B16, it's kind of determining potential length of that ear, and it's based on whatever the conditions are at that time. If you got good moisture and good fertility, it'll optimize that. If you don't, then it won't. Water, it's just, it's all down to water, I think, for us, with corn. This figure there just shows peak water use at different stages with corn. Obviously, tassel and silking, would have some of the highest water use requirements, those early ear stages. But we also need water earlier because the silks actually start growing before we ever see the tassel, and they're really responding to water. Also, this late season ear development requires good moisture conditions. So again, water is kind of everything when we try to optimize yield with corn. So I'm going to start out with tasseling and just kind of make a few comments there. So tassels basically produce pollen, so they contain the male flowers. And when a corn is at VT or tassel, it means that that tassel has emerged through the leaves. All the branches are visible on at least 50% of the plants in the field. So if you look at the tassel structure, you've got this main tassel branch, and then you've got several side branches. And the male flowers, or the anthers, when they release pollen, they basically kind of extrude off of the tassel. So you'll start seeing these little things kind of hanging off of either the main branch or those side branches. So pollen is released a little bit at a time over multiple days. And it mainly starts with that main tassel branch, and then you'll have anthers on those side branches that start releasing pollen. And the reason that you're doing that is to try to protect yourself from, inclement weather. So if I'm releasing a lot of pollen over multiple days, I'm gonna offset, a really hot day here or a dry day there. or a really rainy day here. And it's just kind of a protective thing for the plant. So pollen is only released when the anthers are dry. So usually after the dew dries in the morning, corn can release pollen until it gets too hot. And then when it gets too hot, the anthers stop releasing pollen. So temperature is important, and again, some dry weather to allow that to happen. So again, multiple days, a corn plant can produce well over 1 million grains of pollen, again, over multiple days. So continued wet weather can reduce the amount of pollen shed. And if you've got silks that are waiting and there's, the pollen isn't there, sometimes they're not syncing up right. That can sometimes cause some pollination problems. Heat, really high temperatures in particular, can affect the viability of pollen and make it sterile. I know boron deficiencies, really severe boron deficiencies, sometimes delay the tassel emergence, and sometimes the silks and the tassel won't come out at the same time. So different things can impact tasseling and potentially pollen release. So the reproductive stages of corn, R1 starts with silking and then moves on through to physiological maturity. Basically, at specific key reproductive stages, you're doing a final seed number determination on that ear, or you're looking at maximizing potentially seed size or seed weight, depending on those growth stages. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these stages. So silking, again, reproduction starts with silking, and silks actually start growing before we see the tassel because the plant is trying to sync pollen release and the emergence of the silks above those husk leaves. And so they do have to start growing before we see the tassel. That's why it's important to have good moisture conditions before tasseling. So silks, basically there's one silk attached to an unfertilized ovule on that ear. And the silks generally start growing from the ovules at the base of that ear, and they pollinate first and then kind of work its way up there. So the last silks that are growing out of that ear are going to be from the tip. So if we run out of water, usually we run out of water with those last silks. We start seeing blanks, for example, that's going to be because these silks didn't get, have enough water. So silks are over 50% water. So, if it's dry, the development or the growth rate of the silk is going to slow down, and sometimes we can miss the pollen. So pollen lands on the silk. It develops a pollen tube that grows down to that ovule, and then you have fertilization, and then a kernel develops on that ear. So obviously water is an issue. We need enough water for those silks to grow at a normal pace so that they're out there when the pollen's being shed. Silk clipping from insects, that's another one that sometimes can cause issues if those silks are clipped off, and the pollen can't fertilize the silks. Low phosphorus is one of the fertility issues that sometimes we see that does impact silk production or silk growth. So when silks don't pollinate, they create something called blanks on the ear. And so the picture here on the bottom right, you can see this is it's a good big ear, well pollinated, until you get to that tip. And for whatever reason, when those silks came out, there was no pollen. And so it just didn't happen. So blanks are just kind of tiny little spots there on that ear, where the silk just wasn't able to do what it needed to do. Sometimes with insect clipping, we'll see kind of random missing kernels. This is an example here that we're pretty sure was attributed to silk clipping. And so it's not necessarily at the tip of the ear, it's just random silks, wherever they were clipped, by the insects. So the next two stages, blister and milk stage, or the roasting ear, which is great for folks that like sweet corn. So at these two stages, I'm going to talk about these together because at these two stages, the corn plant is basically going to determine the final number of seed on that cob. So after pollination, whatever has pollinated, The corn plant is going to look at its reserves. How much water do I have? Are my leaves healthy? Is everything going great? Well, if it is, it's going to try to fill all those kernels out. But if it isn't, it'll start throwing those kernels off. So we have kernel abortion. The most kernel abortion occurs at this blister to milk stage. Usually the kernels that are aborted are towards the top end of that ear, because these were the last pollinated. So the first pollinated usually get all the goodies, and the last pollinated only if that plant can support them. So aborted kernels, you can see these pollinated and they're just shriveling up. And again, this is just due to lack of nutrients, lack of water during R2 to R3. So the next couple of stages, R4 and R5, doe and dent. And basically at this point, the kernels that are on the ear are going to make something. It's just a matter of, how much that plant can put into those seed. So between R4 and R5, seed weight or seed size is determined. Test weight, for example, is going to be determined. So during the doe stage, that kernel is starting to accumulate a little bit more starch, and the interior of that seed changes into a thicker, kind of a doughy looking consistency. And during that time, I think by the end of R4, you got about 45% of your dry weight is accumulated by that corn. So R5, which is dent, and it's about 30 days from silking. So R5 is very visual. It's one of the most visual stages when you start talking about ear development. Denting basically means that within that seed, moisture content is going down, hard starch content is going up in that endosperm, and as moisture content drops, that kernel will dent at the tip, at the very top of that seed. The thing about the denting process, there's actually a very visual thing called a milk line that indicates how far along that ear is in the dent process. So if you look at the picture in the top right, this is Drew, my technician, but you basically take an ear of corn, break it in half. You're going to look at the kernel, that flat side of the kernels on the tip end of that ear to see the milk line. So the milk line, and then down here, you've got this dark gold, this is the starch, this lighter color, this is the liquid stuff that's going to convert to starch. And over about 3 weeks, you get this conversion to starch from the tip of that seed down to the base. And then as that line moves, the dent gets a little bit deeper and deeper. So R5 is a really important stage, I think for seed weight. And sometimes, when folks have corn that's denting, they're like, well, my corn is denting, I got a rain, I think, and my crop is made. And you're quite far along in the process, but R5 is really critical because you're accumulating over half of the dry weight during that stage, and R5 or dent will last about 30 days. So it is important to continue to irrigate if it's dry, to try to maximize that dry weight. I mentioned that the milk line is a good visual indicator. In this particular example here, the picture in the bottom right, you can see the milk line is about halfway down those kernels. So if you've got about a 21-day process, you can walk out there and you can say, okay, in this particular example, I've got about 10 or 11 days until I'm at full dent. And that's just by kind of monitoring that milk line. So the things that impact seed weight and seed fill, obviously water stress, but also nitrogen, phosphorus deficiencies, ear diseases, foliar diseases, especially those that impact the top of the canopy, because those leaves above that ear contribute a lot to that ear. If you have corn that is denting and you get a hard freeze, you can actually reduce yield, because a hard freeze will basically stop the dry matter accumulation in the seed, and just wherever it is, that's where it, where it terminates. So it's a really important time for seed fill and also for things like test weight. So after the kernels have fully dented and we can't see a milk line anymore, we're calling this R6, which is physiological maturity. And kind of at this point, the seed is going to separate from the plant, and there's nothing that we can do to add anything more to weight. It doesn't need any more water. You know, it's pretty much done on its own. At the base of those seeds where they attach to the cob, there's going to be a layer of cells that form, and it's called the black layer. And you can actually take fully dented corn with no milk line, and you can dig those seeds out and kind of scrape around the base there and find that little black layer of seeds. It's not disease, it's just a layer of cells that's just cutting that seed off, you know, from the cob. So at physiological maturity, we've gone from 80% moisture at blister stage to about 30 to 35% moisture when corn is considered mature. It's not ready to harvest. You know, it's going to have to dry down. But again, it's done all it's going to do for that season. So, dry down, I'm going to mention a little bit about dry down and harvest. I know Sam is going to, I'm not sure how much Sam is going to cover in some of his information, but, I guess a number of producers have grain bins. Not everyone has drying capability. And so our alternative, we have a lot of corn that potentially dries down in the field until we get closer to that 15–16% moisture level, so that we can avoid those hefty docks at the grain elevators. Plus, we can't store high moisture corn. So drying down, again, it's a heat dependent process. And I think just following some corn, even in a good year where we have low humidity and warm temperatures, the most that I've ever seen is about a percentage point per day. So it's a fairly slow process. Usually it's less than that, maybe half. Some specifics there about the number of heat units. If you're drying corn from very high moisture down to about a 25% level, it takes about 30 heat units per moisture point. Interestingly, as you get below 25 and you start working your way down that moisture scale, it actually takes a little bit more as far as heat units to bring that moisture down a point. And we see this, I think a lot of times we'll have corn where we get some dry down and we think the weather's pretty good, and then it just seems to hit a plateau. It just sort of hovers there at 20, 19, 18, and just sits there and you're just kind of waiting for it. It's just waiting for heat unit accumulation to kind of continue on with the process. Early planted corn is, it dries down better than late planted corn because you've got better conditions in September than you do in a month like October and November. If you've got corn that you're trying to dry down in the field and you want to get it close to 15 or 16% in November, it's almost impossible. You just can't get the heat units, in order to do that. So, on-farm drying, where folks can do it, I think there are a lot of benefits from this. I know there's an economic question in there at what moisture do you harvest, where the drying cost is going to offset the yield loss you're going to get if you leave that corn in the field. And I'm not going to talk about that today. We'll let somebody else cover that. But I will say from an agronomy standpoint, leaving corn in the field and letting it dry down, there is a measurable loss in yield. And it's not only just, the corn lodges and falls over, or it gets a little more disease on it, or the bugs get after it, or whatever. It's just the physical process of drying down. We're releasing water, and so water adds some weight to the seed. But also, just because when those seeds mature on the cob, they're not dead, they're living. They're living until something happens to them. So as long as they're living on that ear, they're going to use stored energy to keep going. Especially if you've got corn sitting out there and it's pretty hot, the seeds still have to cool themselves a little bit. So they're going to use some of that stored energy in order to keep going. And so over time, that actually reduces the weight of the seed. So you're losing moisture, but you're also losing weight because those seed are trying to keep themselves alive. I think most of the time, 25% is about as high as folks go when they're trying to go after higher moisture corn. You can go higher than that, but I think sometimes we don't, it doesn't shell off the ear very well when you go super high. About 25% for a starting point helps reduce, I think, yield loss from letting corn dry down, especially well below 18. Bob Nielsen did some work over a number of years. They were looking at different relative maturity hybrids planted on different dates and harvesting at different moistures and trying to figure out, is there a benefit to actually going and harvesting 20 to 25% moisture corn compared to letting it dry down, naturally in the field. So on average, what he found was that there's about a 1% loss in yield for every percentage point of moisture that you let that corn dry down in the field. And at some point, it's going to be economically feasible to go in and get that corn earlier and try to dry it down, in the grain bin. So, and again, I think Sam is going to address, some of this other information as well. So I've got one more slide here. The thing that we do, and I know we all are real good about this, we go out and look at corn when we're trying to figure out how far along it is and, when it might be ready to harvest, some of those things. But I think, there are some consultants and there are companies that offer services to producers where they use long-term weather data and they use it to try to predict some key growth stages and make management decisions kind of from a distance. I will say that I think some of the models that are being used now are better than they were a few years ago. I'm just going to show you this one because I think it's a pretty neat one. It's free. The University of Illinois houses this one, but they use long-term weather data. You can plug in the relative maturity of your hybrid, the field location, and it will do some of those predictive things. So it's just a predictive tool, and we hope that my link works. Okay. So with this one, let's see if I can get, I'm not scrolling down. Okay, for some reason I'm not able to scroll. There we go. Okay, so they started in the Midwest and they added Kentucky and Tennessee. So basically you use this by going in and clicking on your county, and I'm just going to click one here. And it says create a GDD graph. And I'm going to go here and I'm going to plug in a planting date and a maturity. And you can compare this year to other years. So like we can compare it to 2019. But what it does is that it uses this long-term data, and my understanding is that they're getting data from your region, because I've compared Crockett County versus Cannon County versus an East Tennessee County, and those numbers do change. So you plug this in and it will just give you a prediction about your silking date, and then this would be your black layer date. The fields that we put in here this year got actually pretty close. We haven't black layered yet, and it's got a predictive date that's about a week and a half out. So I think it's actually going to be close. So you can do something like that. I think it's kind of neat. If you go to this data tab, it also makes predictions about some of these key vegetative stages, which might be pertinent if you're applying herbicide, fungicide, and just some of those other things. So again, it's a pretty good predictive tool. It's free. So if you like stuff like that, let me see if I can get back to my, it's just kind of an option there for you. So I think with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Does anyone have any questions or? Okay, well, if not, let me Get out of this one. And I think Larry is on next.